1964, the North Pacific. An American aircraft carrier's radar picks up a slow-moving blip skimming just above the waves. A U.S. Navy Skyhawk jet screams out to intercept, only to find an antiquated-looking Soviet flying boat plodding along, twin propellers churning and red stars on its wings. It was a Beriev Be-6, a plane that NATO sailors grew to recognize and respect, a Cold War spy plane that shadowed fleets and snooped on secrets from the sea's surface. Now, the end of World War II ushered in a new kind of tension, the Cold War. From the Arctic Circle to the Pacific tropics, new front lines were drawn across oceans. The United States and its allies commanded fleets of aircraft carriers and long-range patrol planes prowling those waters. The Soviet Union, with far fewer bases abroad, pursued another path, a giant seaplane that could rove over remote seas and keep watch where no other radar tower or friendly ship could reach. As Western navies bristling with warships patrolled the oceans, the USSR urgently needed eyes in the skies and on the waves. Enter the Beriev Be-6, conceived in the closing days of World War II and born in the late 40s. This ungainly flying boat was designed for maritime reconnaissance and patrol. It would become one of the Soviet Navy's more persistent sentinels, prowling vast stretches of ocean in search of NATO ships and submarines. The Be-6 was intended to be a jack of all trades, part long-range scout, part torpedo bomber, and even part transport. Yet it ended up carving out a niche as a high-seas spy, quietly observing NATO's maneuvers from afar. In an era of rapidly advancing jet technology, this slow twin-engine seaplane might have seemed like a relic, but looks can be deceiving. Over 2 decades of service, the Be-6 proved its worth as a hardy maritime workhorse and a thorn in NATO's side on the world's oceans. In this video, we're going to explore how the Be-6 was developed, the clever ways that it stalked its targets, and what led to its quiet retirement. If you love uncovering Cold War aviation stories like this, be sure to subscribe to our channel. There are plenty more secret planes and forgotten flyers to explore. Now, in the midst of World War II, Soviet engineers realized that they lacked a long-range patrol aircraft comparable to the Western Allies' Catalinas and Sunderlands. Georgy Beriev, the Soviet Union's master of seaplane design, was tasked in 1943 with creating a formidable twin-engine flying boat that could meet the Navy's needs. It was meant to replace the Soviet Navy's obsolete pre-war MBR-2 flying boat and extend patrol reach far beyond what had been possible. The result was a prototype called the LL-143. Which took to the air in 1945 as the war ended. This early prototype went through several rounds of improvements as Beriev's team refined the design. By February of 1949, the first production model was ready for its maiden flight. Production would continue through 1957, with ultimately 123 of these aircrafts built. The Beriev Be-6 officially entered operational service in 1951, and the type soon equipped Soviet naval aviation units. At a glance, the Be-6 bore a resemblance to Allied flying boats of the previous decade. One may liken it to a Martin Mariner on steroids. It featured a high gull wing to keep the engine clear of spray when operating from water, and a tail-twin empennage rising from a boat-like hull. Now, construction was mostly metal, giving it durability for harsh maritime conditions. Now, under the hood, it packed 2 powerful Shvetsov ASH-73 radial engines. 18-cylinder beasts also used on the Tu-4 bomber, each delivering about 2,400 horsepower. These engines gave the Be-6 respectable range and endurance. It could stay aloft for well over 12 hours and traverse roughly 4,000 to 5,000 kilometers without refueling. Those radials were temperamental, though, requiring careful upkeep, especially in salty, harsh conditions of marine operations. Now, mechanics often had to perform engine overhauls in less than ideal field conditions, a true test of ground crew ingenuity. For a crew accustomed to icy northern seas or remote Pacific expanses, the aircraft's long range was a lifeline. Now, the design wasn't just about endurance, however. The Be-6 was built to carry a bite. Beriev's flying boat could haul up to 4,000 kilograms of weapons under its broad wings. Various combinations of torpedoes, depth charges, or naval mines could be mounted on the hardpoints outboard of the engine nacelles. Now, this payload meant that the Be-6 could not only spot enemy vessels, but also attack them if a war broke out. To defend itself in hostile skies, early versions bristled with cannons, twin 23mm cannons and a dorsal turret, and another pair and a tail turret guarding its rear. There was even a forward gun position planned into the nose, though it was deleted in production. NATO codenamed the aircraft Madge, and pilots who encountered it often noted its bristling armament. For a so-called spy plane, Madge certainly carried some teeth. Yet the Be-6's development was not without hiccups. The immediate post-war years were lean, and perfecting the design took some time. The the Soviet Navy didn't receive the type in significant numbers until the early 50s. A planned passenger transport variant, dubbed the Be-6K, was explored to support Arctic operations. One full-scale mock-up was built in 1946, but it never went into production. Instead, Beriev and his team focused on fine-tuning the patrol bomber variant. A few early production models were even diverted to Aeroflot for Arctic service, stripped of weapons and fitted with extra fuel tanks. These modified Be-6s ferried supplies to remote polar stations. It was a far cry from hunting NATO submarines, but a testament to the robust airframe's utility. The Be-6's basic design was sound enough to be adapted for multiple roles, and it would soon prove its mettle in the role that it was born for. Now, what made the Beriev Be-6 such a fixture of Cold War maritime patrol? Well, part of the answer lies in its blend of old-school design and smart adaptations. On one hand, it was a traditional flying boat. It needed no runway, alighting gracefully, or sometimes not so gracefully, on open water. This allowed the Soviet Navy to operate from isolated bays and icy inlets without airfields, provided that the seas were calm enough. It could taxi on water and be hauled ashore with beaching gear for maintenance, much like the seaplanes of World War II. This flexibility was crucial for a nation with vast underdeveloped coastlines and limited access to overseas bases. Now, on the other hand, the Be-6 gradually incorporated modern technology to keep it relevant in the new age of electronic warfare. By the mid-1950s, as the submarine threat grew, many Be-6s received a major upgrade. The tail gun turret was removed and replaced with a magnetic anomaly detector, or MAD boom. This tail stinger housed sensors to pick up the faint magnetic signature of submarines that were lurking beneath the waves. In essence, the Be-6 became a sub-hunter, one of the Soviet Union's first aircraft that were optimized for anti-submarine warfare. It could slowly crisscross suspected areas, dragging its MAD boom like a metal detector over the ocean to pinpoint subs below. When it found something, the Be-6 could call in a faster attack unit or even drop a depth charge itself. Additionally, a radar was fitted in a retractable radome beneath the fuselage, allowing the crew to scan the horizon and sea surface for ships or a periscope. Some accounts suggest that it could deploy sonar buoys from its roomy interior, further extending its ears into the ocean depths. With an 8-man crew typically on board, including pilots, navigators, radio operators, and gunners or sensor operators, the Be-6 functioned as a mobile maritime outpost in the sky. Crew stations in the nose, dorsal turret, tail, and cockpit all provided all-around observation. There was even a space to carry additional crew or passengers, which came in handy for long missions or search and rescue forays. Crucially, the Be-6 had impressive endurance. Missions of 10 to 15 hours were not uncommon. Imagine the stamina required. Hours upon hours of droning over empty ocean, scanning for any sign of a ship's wake or a submarine's periscope. In those long stretches, the aircraft's reliable engines and stable handling were prized. Pilots often praised its ability to ride out rough weather, not a small consideration when you might have to land on a choppy sea. It had a boat-shaped hull that was strong enough to handle open water landings, within reason, and in emergencies it could set down to rescue downed airmen or sailors in distress. All of these qualities made the Be-6 a sturdy sentinel, able to stay on station when other aircrafts may have to turn back. Of course, these capabilities, they came with trade-offs. The Be-6 was slow and a bit lumbering, and it demanded careful flying and maintenance. But in the role it was built for, it was highly effective. By the time the Be-6 was fully operational in the early 50s, the Cold War was in full swing. Soviet naval aviation squadrons deployed these flying boats to monitor the vast northern waters of the Arctic Ocean and North Pacific, as well as to patrol the Baltic and Black Seas. Wherever NATO navies sailed near Soviet interests, a Be-6 may not be very far off, lurking beyond the horizon. Their missions were typically long-range reconnaissance, essentially to be the eyes of the Soviet fleet, spotting NATO warships, convoys, or any unusual activity at sea. One could picture a scene repeated many times during that era. A Western destroyer or carrier group cruising in the international waters would suddenly get a radar contact of a low-flying aircraft. Minutes later, lookouts on deck would catch sight of a gray twin-engine flying boat in the distance, skimming the wavetops and keeping just far enough away to avoid provocation. That intruder is likely a Be-6, calmly taking photos and radioing in the fleet's position. NATO forces often scrambled fighters to intercept and identify these snoopers. The intercept pilots were occasionally surprised at what they found. The Be-6 looked like something from a bygone age. Yep, there it was, hundreds of miles from any land and confidently carrying out its mission. Such encounters ranged from routine to tense. In one notable incident, a U.S. Navy A-4 Skyhawk from the carrier USS Bennington intercepted a Be-6 north of Japan in 1964. The American pilot flew alongside the lumbering Soviet flying boat. wingtips nearly overlapping, as the crews exchanged curious glances across the void. The Skyhawk, a nimble jet, was armed to the teeth and could have easily shot the intruder down, yet this was peacetime cat and mouse, not open combat. Instead, the pilot simply escorted the Be-6 away from the task force. The incident illustrated both the Be-6's vulnerability and its clever use. With a top speed of only about 400 kilometers per hour, or about 250 miles an hour, the flying boat was no match for jet fighters in open combat. If caught alone in near skies, it would be an easy target despite its defensive guns. Soviet crews therefore learned to fly low over the waves, use cloud cover, and exploit foul weather to stay hidden. In effect, the Be-6 survived by choosing its battles, or rather by avoiding them. Scenes like that played out in oceans all around the world. The old-fashioned spy plane and the state-of-the-art fighter, eyeing each other in a silent duel of nerves. For the Soviet Navy, the information that these patrols brought back was invaluable. Be-6 crews would shadow foreign naval exercises, map shipping lanes, and even eavesdrop on radio traffic whenever possible. During the 50s and early 60s, the Soviet Union lacked the extensive satellite network and long-range drones that came later, so aircrafts like the Be-6 would fill the gap. They kept watch for Western submarines, particularly the new nuclear-powered ones that could lurk off Soviet shores with nuclear missiles. Ironically, the Be-6, with its relatively low speed and World War II-era origins, was pitted against some of the more advanced threats of the day: high-speed jet bombers and deep-diving subs. It was a classic Cold War asymmetry, a plodding flying boat chasing high-tech prey. Now, operating such a large seaplane had its perils. A few Be-6s were sadly lost over the years due to accidents or unforgiving weather, but those incidents aside, the fleet served diligently through the 50s and into the 60s. By the mid-1960s, newer platforms began to assume the Be-6's duties. The Soviets introduced the Ilyushin IL-38, a land-based maritime patrol plane, and a turboprop-powered Beriev Be-12 Chaika amphibian, both far more modern ASW aircraft, to take over the hunting of native subs and long-range ocean surveillance. The writing was on the wall for old Madge. Soviet naval aviation gradually phased out the Be-6 and frontline units toward the late 60s. However, in a few out-of-the-way bases, the aircraft would soldier on a bit longer. Some Be-6s were reassigned to civilian agencies or secondary roles. There are reports of unarmed Be-6s being used for fishery patrol and Arctic supply runs into the early 70s. Their combat days are over, but their wings are still strong. One could argue that for a plane introduced around 1950, surviving in any capacity into the 70s was quite the achievement, given the whirlwind of aviation progress during those decades. If you're enjoying this deep dive into a Cold War icon, hey, we ask you real quick, hit that like button and let us know. And if you haven't already, join our community by subscribing for more intriguing aviation history tales. All right, now back to the story. Now, perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Be-6's tale is how this ungainly flying boat became a quiet hero of Soviet maritime aviation. It arrived at a time when the USSR had few tools to keep tab on NATO at sea, and it filled that void with determination. There's a certain irony in the fact that some of the free world's most sophisticated warships were being tailed by a propeller-driven giant that looked straight out of World War II. Yet, time and time again, the Be-6 would deliver results. It found itself in the thick of Cold War spy games, not in a glamorous way like a U-2 high over Moscow or a clandestine spy submarine, but in the day-in, day-out routine of patrol and vigilance. In terms of direct action, the Be-6 never dropped a torpedo in anger or engaged in any shooting war. Thankfully, the Cold War stayed cold in its theaters of operation. Its battles were battles of wits and endurance. Did the Be-6 ever see combat? Well, not in the traditional sense. And that was by design. The goal was deterrence and surveillance, not a dogfight. In a way, each mission completed without a shot fired was a victory in the Cold War chess match. A Be-6 crew might spend a grueling night over a monsoon-tossed Pacific, trusting their instruments and each other to track a distant naval force. Or maybe they'd skim along Arctic ice floes for hours, searching for any sign of an intruding submarine. These quiet acts of service kept their adversaries guessing and forced NATO to always account for the eyes of Madge lurking beyond the horizon. In fact, more than a few times, these shadowing missions led to diplomatic complaints. Western officials would protest the presence of Soviet aircraft in sensitive areas, and the Soviets would counter that their patrols were perfectly legal in international airspace. It was a delicate dance that played out year after year, always on the edge, but never tipping into any kind of direct conflict. One highlight that underscores the Be-6's significance is its extended second life abroad. When relations between Moscow and Beijing soured after 1960, the Chinese Navy was left with 20 Be-6s that the Soviets had supplied. Lacking further support, the Chinese maintained and even improved these aircraft on their own. During the 1970s, the original piston engines began to wear out, so Chinese engineers replaced them with turboprop engines. The Chinese made WJ-6, creating an updated hybrid designated the King 6. This gave the old airframes a new lease on life. Throughout the 1960s, Chinese BE-6s flew regular patrols over the Yellow Sea and South China Sea, keeping watch on foreign naval movements and gathering intelligence along China's maritime borders. They effectively filled the same role that the Soviets had designed the plane for, only now serving a new master under a different flag. China would eventually develop its own amphibious patrol aircraft, like the later Harbin SH-5, to succeed the venerable BE-6, but not before squeezing every ounce of utility from those aging airframes. Incredibly, reports suggest that a handful of these Chinese BE-6 flying boats were still operational into the 80s, and at least 2 were spotted at a naval base as late as 2003, nearly half a century after the type first flew. Such longevity is virtually unheard of, and it speaks to the solid fundamentals of the BE-6's design. It may not have been cutting edge, but it was dependable. This improbable postscript, a 1940 Soviet spy plane variant still lurking in Chinese waters at the dawn of the 21st century, is a testament to the aircraft's legacy. It also symbolizes how the Cold War cast a long shadow. Its machines, strategies, and stories echoed far beyond the dates that are marked in history books. The Beriev Be-6 today lives on mostly in museums and photographs, a relic of an earlier age of espionage at sea. Only a couple of examples remain intact. One rests, appropriately, by the water at a museum in China, and another sits under the gray Ukrainian sky in Kiev's Aviation Museum. They're strange, captivating beasts to look at. Big radial engines, broad gull wings, and hulls built to meet the waves. To modernize, the BE-6 might seem a little anachronistic, even quaint, but 7 decades ago, these flying boats were on the front line of a simmering conflict, tirelessly combing the oceans for any sign of trouble. In the grand scope of aviation history, the BE-6 was not the fastest, nor the most advanced, nor produced in the thousands, but its role in the Cold War was significant. It gave the Soviet Union a maritime reconnaissance capability when it desperately needed one, and it helped pioneer the tactics and technology of anti-submarine warfare for a navy racing to catch up. The BE-6 also marked the twilight of the Great Flying Boat era. By the 70s, most nations had retired their seaplanes in favor of land-based patrol aircraft and helicopters. The U.S. last patrol flying boat flew its final mission in 1967. Now, in the Soviet Union, after the BE-6 and its turboprop successor, the BE-12, no new large combat flying boats were developed, apart from experimental projects. The world's oceans would henceforth be watched by sleek turboprops, jets, and satellites. Yet the memory of the BE-6 and its ilk survives as a nostalgic reminder of when maritime patrol sometimes meant literally getting one's feet wet. More on that. The story of the BE-6 is a reminder that sometimes older, simpler tools can find purpose in more modern conflicts. The BE-6 was among the last of the great military flying boats, a direct descendant of the Catalinas and Sunderlands of World War II, and a creature almost extinct by the 1970s. After that, the era of big piston engine patrol seaplanes virtually vanished. While jets thundered overhead and spy satellites winked from orbit, a humble flying boat quietly patrolled the lonely seas, keeping a superpower informed and prepared. As we reflect on the BE-6's legacy, it stands as an emblem of Cold War resourcefulness, a rugged scout that served its country well and even found a second life abroad. Not all heroes of the Cold War are celebrated. Some, like this one, did their duty in relative obscurity, overshadowed by flashier machines, but for the sailors and airmen who relied on it, Madge was a dependable guardian of the coasts and a watchful eye on the waves. If you enjoyed this journey back in time with the Soviet spy plane that shadowed NATO's secrets, please subscribe to our channel for more well-researched aviation history videos. We've got plenty more stories of forgotten planes and unsung aviators to share. And don't forget to like this video and drop a comment about what Cold War aircraft you'd like to see next. Until next time, thanks for flying with us through history.